voters do not have a responsibility to political parties. It's the political parties that have a responsibility to earn the vote of the population. You could have images of a marcher holding the indigenous Wipala flag with a bleeding head being led away by the police. And these photos were indistinguishable from the sort of photos you saw during the coup. And that's when most ordinary members realized that this is not our government, this is not our party. When Evo Morales leaves, is no longer president, there was no longer a clear figurehead for who was exactly leading this movement.
Hello and welcome to Attrition. I'm your host, Ammar Kazmi, and in this show, we delve into the forces of war, imperialism, and Zionism, exploring their impact on our world and what it will take to overcome them. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by none other than Ollie Vargas. Ollie is a producer and journalist based in Bolivia and the co founder of the vital news outlet Causachun News. He's also worked with a number of other outlets, including Mint Press, Telesur, and The Grey Zone, providing essential coverage not just of Bolivia, but also the rest of Latin America. Ollie, thank you very much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me on. I think it's going to be a really good discussion.
This discussion is obviously taking place in the context of the ongoing Bolivian presidential election. So the first round took place on the 17th of August. The second round, of course, is scheduled for the 19th of October. But before we get into all of that, just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, what's so special about Bolivia? I mean, from an international perspective, why should we care about the politics of this South American country with 12 million people? What makes it important? And what are the lessons that we can draw from it?
Well, I think one thing that has gathered a lot of interest during the time that I've been reporting on Bolivia, since around 2019, was that Bolivia, I think, contains a lot of lessons that can be applied universally. You know, going back, looking at the government of Evo Morales, for example, the manner in which he was able to turn the poorest country in Latin America into its fastest growing economy through policies like nationalization of natural resources and the largest industries of the country. I think that has lessons about, what economic policy would look like for a government of the left once in power, and how, all of the different policies associated with that when it comes to monetary policy, infrastructure development. These are all things I think people can learn from that are very exciting about what a government of the left can do, within the restraints of an international system. But also, I think, more recently, there's been a catastrophic split within the ruling party, which has been one of the most important parties of the left, one of the most important socialist parties in Latin America for the past 20, well, longer really, in government for 20 years, but have been around for around 30 years. Today, that is split into at least three different factions. So I think looking over all of that experiences, the successes, the challenges, I think it's something that can inform the left around the world.
But of course, Bolivia is also important because it's in what the US likes to call its backyard and what it considers its apparent sphere of influence. And Bolivia is rich in natural resources like tin, zinc, silver, and crucially, it's also rich in lithium. Can you talk a bit about Bolivia's importance in terms of imperial interests?
Well, I mean, Bolivia's strategic position in the center of Latin America obviously makes it important, but it's been its natural resources throughout history that has made Bolivia a central component of numerous different Western empires, starting with the Spanish colonial empire, and where Bolivia had the largest silver mine in the region, something that fueled the development of Europe in many ways, and the slavery that was needed to carry out that to to extract that silver has shaped the demographics and class composition of Bolivian society to this day. And then moving later, the mining resources, the numerous different mining resources, the Bolivia led the way despite exporting such vast amounts to the international markets, was in a state of such extreme poverty. Its people were in such a state of extreme poverty for all of its history. And then later on with, you have the natural gas, oil, things like this that put Bolivia once again, at the center of the US's crosshairs at a time when the US was fighting wars for oil in the Middle East and was fighting a economic war against the government of Venezuela. Bolivia also had significant oil and gas reserves. So that became another point of contention between Bolivia and the United States. And then we see with the rise of electric vehicles, the development of green technologies, the issue of lithium suddenly became center stage. So, and Bolivia has one of the world's largest reserves of lithium, together with Argentina and Chile and a few others. But Bolivia has some of the largest out of all of them. And Bolivia was placed at the center of what would be the future of a lot of these green technologies. And that's a bone of contention that's still very much in play at the moment.
It's interesting to note as well that the US, in typical imperialist arrogance, has an interest in getting Bolivian lithium. I mean, directly after the coup against Evo Morales in 2019, Elon Musk, the leader, chief executive of Tesla, notoriously said, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." I mean, he's an Afrikaner, but he lives in the United States, and that's actually not out of keeping, uh, either in terms of his Afrikaner heritage or his current place of residence. And then you had the very pro-US candidate Jorge Quiroga, who's actually a former president of Bolivia, and he'll be contesting the second runoff round in October, saying that he intends to privatize Bolivia's natural resources, which of course includes lithium. So this is obviously something that's very important, but this is nothing new if you consider Bolivia's history. So in 1951, the MNR, the Revolutionary Nationalist Movement, the center-left party, came to power in Bolivia, and it nationalized the country's tin mines. And then you very quickly saw a reaction from the United States, which actually successfully pressured the government, which had expropriated the mines, to compensate them for taking control of their own national resources. I mean, God forbid that they, have control over their own land. And then there was further pressure later down the line where the US forced that government to make changes to its cabinet, to remove people that they didn't like, that they thought were too socialist. And then they also forced involvement by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to intervene in Bolivia's economic policy. And then by the time you get to 1964, which is when that government is overthrown in a military coup, it had actually already become quite right wing as a result of succumbing to US pressure. But regardless, they're replaced by this new military dictatorship. And then actually, there were successive military regimes because Bolivia became part of Operation Condor, which people can go and research. But broadly speaking, that was a continent wide plan in Latin America by the US and the CIA to replace various left wing governments in the continent with military dictatorships. And of course, that then saw the battle testing of neoliberalism in Chile, for example, under Pinochet. But while you had these military regimes in places like Bolivia, the people, of course, still fought back. And then in 1999, there was the Cochabamba water war, and that saw indigenous people and other social movements resist against the privatization of Bolivia's water. And in 2005, you have this landslide victory under Evo Morales with the MAS, and you saw these poor, working, indigenous people assert their rights and their power in the country. That then lasted until 2019 when there was this US-backed coup against Evo Morales. The right wing Janine Áñez was put in power. But a year later, because of the resistance from indigenous people, from social movements, the MAS was returned to power under Luis Arce. So people will be interested to know how all of that unraveled. I mean, people were obviously delighted in 2020 to see the MAS coming back to power, the coup being defeated, Evo Morales returning from exile to Bolivia, and there seemed to be lots of euphoria and an unprecedented unity in the country. But that was obviously very short-lived. And then we started to see slowly these divisions appearing within the MAS, which appeared to center largely around different personalities, in particular Luis Arce and Evo Morales. In your view, when and why did these cracks start to appear?
It's important to remember the structure of the party. It's called the Movement Towards Socialism. It was set up not really as a traditional party, an organization in which individuals can join through, pay monthly membership or something. It was more set up as a coalition of social movements, essentially. So founded firstly by the indigenous movements, indigenous, essentially rural workers unions, but they didn't want to create a purely indigenous party. So this has to be something that can encompass the whole of the people, of the popular classes. So, the urban workers unions were brought in, and also sections of the middle class left. And those are people were essentially the remnants of the traditional left, um, you know, Communist Party, Trotskyism is actually historically very big in Bolivia, Social Democratic Party, all of these that had been very big in Bolivia throughout the 20th century, but essentially, like has happened around the rest of the world, kind of began to crumble away after the fall of the Soviet Union. But many of the mass was able to kind of get all of these people together under one umbrella, and essentially build a confederation of all of these social forces. And this is essentially the majority of the country. You're right. The rural working class, the urban working class, the progressive middle class. This constitutes the majority of the country, and they were able to convert that into an electoral majority as well. Now, there's obviously a number of tensions can come when you have such a broad coalition. Not only for which which policies should be adopted, but also about who takes what positions. Now, one thing you have to remember is, perhaps the left in this country is not accustomed to having uh, state power, has never had state power really. But when you do have state power, what you suddenly have is a movement of people who have always been excluded suddenly have access to giant resources essentially, and you also have to begin a process of transforming the character of the state. That that includes cleaning out a lot of the civil service of the old regime, rebuilding that with people that come from social movements, from unions, indigenous movements, etc. Now, which is something that's absolutely needed. Now, then what happens is, and what happened in Bolivia, I think there began to be disputes over, what sections of the state, which constituencies within the movement has. So some groups say, "Oh, we want this ministry. Oh, we want that ministry." Um, the transport unions say, "We want the Ministry of Transport." But then the Ministry of Agriculture, there's disputes between different regions about from which region will the minister come from, things like this. But they were all able to be always managed, I think, during Evo Morales' presidency, by the fact that he was a unifying leader, that wherever disputes were had, and were had openly, could be settled in a democratic way. And once they were, people were happy to go along with it. A kind of democratic centralism almost. That once a decision was adopted, people were happy to abide by it. Particularly because Evo Morales was the leadership the figurehead of all of this. I think, personally, I think when Evo Morales leaves, is no longer president, there was no longer a clear figurehead for who was exactly leading this movement. Yes, Luis Arce had been elected as president. He'd been chosen to be the presidential candidate by Evo Morales himself. He'd been Evo Morales' economy minister. But here's someone who comes from the middle class, from the progressive middle class. He was there because of his knowledge about economics, and in fact, he'd studied a master's degree here in England in Warwick, and he was brought in for those qualities. He wasn't a political leader. He wasn't someone who has come up through years of struggle. So it was unclear who was leading this movement anymore, and that's something I think that a lot of movements around the world have often found themselves in such a situation. And when you don't have a clear sense of direction, of leadership, a number of fiefdoms begin to emerge, different nodes of power, different people who claim control over different portions of power. That became the root of a lot of the problems. And then the issue of which class as well is the leadership. You know, uh, in the old communist parties or old, you know, in Marxist theory, they say that a communist party has to be built with the working class, the proletariat as the vanguard. And the idea of the mass was that the leadership was the rural indigenous social movements. That goes with Luis Arce. And actually, you see the progressive middle class section of that coalition begin to be empowered. They're the ones who begin to take a lot of the ministries, state jobs, and you know, essentially the levers of the state. People weren't opposed to this, but people began to feel a bit excluded. Those who had worked in Evo Morales' government were wondering a bit, you know, is this still are we being pushed out here? And you know, amidst that process, there began to be, you know, what I would characterize as a number of personal power struggles, but which became a proxy for what was actually a clash between different classes within the movement.
Well, here's where I want to interject slightly because what you're saying sounds quite cynical. It appears to just be this sort of clash of personalities, the carving up of different parts of the state between different factions, personal ambitions, all of that sort of thing. But were there any ideological differences between this new technocratic class under Luis Arce and the more indigenous peasant worker class aligned with Evo Morales?
Well, I would focus on class forces rather than ideology. I would focus on which constituencies within the mass were being empowered and which were being excluded. And what we saw in Evo Morales' government was a much greater participation from unions, from rural indigenous movements, and then that participation from those movements wanes and goes completely under Luis Arce. And he's replaced by a middle class that would define itself as socialist, as people who have read lots of books by Marx and Engels and things like this. But the class character had clearly changed. I think that's a lot to do as well with some of the wider shifts in class composition of the country as a whole, which were undeniable. The fact that a big achievement of Evo Morales' government was to reduce the rate of poverty, sort of the number of the percentage of the country that lives below the UN defined poverty line, which in 2005, when he took power, was 67%, which is the highest in the region. Um, he reduced that to just under 30% by the time but by the time he left office in 2019. So that, you know, behind that figure is millions of people who were lifted out of poverty, many of them entering the middle class. And I think that the empowerment of the middle class faction within the left also coincided with the growth of the middle class in the country at large. And a lot of people saw these demographic changes in the country and, you know, thought that the way to respond to this is by trying to reflect society, becoming more middle class ourselves, becoming, um, you know, changing the class character of the class leadership of the movement to adapt to these changing realities. And of course, the problem with that is then the original base, which are the majority of the party, then began to feel very excluded. And as I said, I think the different personal power plays and factional battles that there were, which are very important, I think were in reality a proxy for a class struggle in some ways within the party. And you know, it does raise the question of how these things can be balanced. How, you know, especially when you have to control the levers of the state, how you balance the different coalitions, the different constituencies that you have. And I think it was managed poorly, and that was the root. I think this class conflict that began to emerge within the left.
One thing that you said, which is very interesting, is that under Evo Morales, people were lifted out of poverty. But that success that he instituted in Bolivia may be a reason why the whole thing eventually fell apart. I mean, people sometimes like to talk about the revolution eating its own children. In this case, it seems like the revolution's children have eaten the revolution because many of the people who were uplifted by, benefited from the revolution, including through education, through social mobility, have actually turned against it. And obviously, I'm not talking about revolution in the literal sense because Evo Morales uh, came to power through, democratic elections. But I think the principle remains the same. We, of course, see other examples of this in Cuba and in Iran, where people who have achieved some benefit from the revolutionary state, particularly through education, can start to turn away from that state. And in the case of Bolivia, I just wonder, is that a fair assessment to make? I mean, the fact that its own success, in a strange way, has potentially led to these divisions, these class divisions in the mass, and this political recomposition.
Yeah, definitely. That I think that's certainly true, and it's interesting. I mean, just from a sort of sociological point of view, to look at the composition of who are the people that are being brought out of poverty, where are they ending up, and it's quite interesting. I think a certain portion of the people that have entered the middle class, and I'm talking about the case of Bolivia here, a small portion have ended up actually in the public sector as the public sector grew massively, not just in public services, but in the state sectors of the economy. So in natural resources. In fact, a number of during Evo Morales' government, for example, state factories that were created to process different natural resources, which was very interesting. The state's portion of the economy went beyond what one would traditionally think of as the commanding heights of the economy. Things like telecom, airline, those were nationalized, and even but also things on a smaller scale. For example, Evo Morales created a glass making factory that created all of the glass bottles in Bolivia, including those for Coca-Cola and the largest beer company. So they were paying the state to create their bottles, and a number of people. It was a huge factory, lots of people working there. Some of those people go into this state sector, and those sections of the population actually remained and became a constituency for Luis Arce's sort of progressive middle class. Um, a much larger section who went into commerce and the private sector. That's the constituency that ended up shifting to the right. But their own development out from poverty into the middle class does owe itself to the government of the left, because it was the government of the left that invested in infrastructure, in education, that made the growth of the wider economy, including the growth of the private sector, possible. However, because it's in this indirect manner, I think many people don't associate it that way. Many people, once they enter a certain tax bracket, believe that one's success is purely down to oneself, and almost see socialist politics and working class politics as something beneath them. And that's certainly dynamic that exists in Bolivia. These governments are left often they create their own grave diggers through growing a middle class. In the same way Marx said that capitalism creates its grave diggers by creating a working class, a similar process has happened here.
Mm. Just turning now to what's happened over the last year in particular, because there are lots of events that may have passed people by if they haven't been paying attention. So in June 2024, there was this apparent military coup against Luis Arce, which Evo Morales actually said was fake. He said it was a self coup designed to shore up support for Arce. Then in September 2024, Morales led these mass protests that included roadblocks and physical confrontations on the street. In October last year, there was an assassination attempt against Evo Morales. Then fast forward to May 2025, Bolivia's constitutional court banned Morales from standing in this year's presidential election because they said that the presidency under the constitution was limited to 2 terms. Can you expand on some of these events and others that I might actually have missed, and just explain how tumultuous this last year has been?
The cracks first began to appear around, say, early 2022. It began kind of campaigns of rumor and gossip among, people at the top, senators and ministers, this kind of thing. And quite quickly, it became a split that, was all encompassing and actually went down to the lowest levels of the party, to the point where actually, rural communities would be split among themselves and would have altercations within a community over, for example, who gets to be party secretary, who gets to be union secretary, and things like this, along the lines of the dispute between Evo Morales and Luis Arce. And the idea that a party, a party of the left can split multiple different ways and destroy its project is something that's that's happened in everywhere, in almost every country of the world, unfortunately. But I think that the level of animosity and actually violence is actually quite rare. I think Bolivia is quite a rare example of just in terms of how far it went, to the point where actually you had an assassination attempt against Evo Morales. I was able to find out actually what the real story was in that regard, because Evo Morales essentially came out on social media with video evidence of his car being shot at by the police. Can you imagine this? Comrades of the same party now using the state to shoot at your former leaders. It's quite a dramatic level of internal party split. The government, though, denied it. They said, this wasn't the case. He staged it himself, blah, blah. I was able to figure out what really happened, seeing, just anecdotally, just seeing someone I knew who works in the Interior Ministry, who, after a couple of drinks, was for some reason very happy to start talking about what really happened. Was that their plan was to arrest Evo Morales. His car speeds away to avoid arrest, and that's when the police start shooting at them. And to reach that level of violence is devastating. Especially when I think back to the times I had in 2020, for example, in the struggle against the coup government, the successful struggle in overthrowing the coup government. The level of unity there was incredible. This is something, you could walk into any rural town, any working class area of the big cities, uh, with one of the candidates, and you'd have masses of people coming around you. Even people who had become perhaps a bit disillusioned with the party were all flooding back in. It was a moment of massive unity, and it was that unity that shook the coup government to its core and made it realize they would have to leave power, because actually their original plan was to not hold elections and to continue as a dictatorship. They realized they weren't able to do that because of the strength of the unity among ordinary people that was expressed then in numerous struggles, uprisings. And I remember in August of 2020 when people were blocking all of the main highways in the country, essentially erecting barricades. And I was there on some of these. You had people saying, we don't want elections anymore. We're going to march to the capital. We're going to take the capital. And it was Evo Morales who talked people down from that to say, no, we have the majority. We're going to win. We have to keep the struggle up till we force them to have elections. And that has to be the goal, because we're going to win. From that level of, such inspiring unity to the situation we have now, where people are, just carrying out acts of violence against each other, is a crying shame, just from the point of view for those who've been part of the process, and part of the process in a disinterested manner, for wanting the project to succeed. In many ways, that even friendships, splitting apart, even at that level, it's been an unfortunate past few years.
One thing that you mentioned is that Luis Arce and his supporters have been using the levers of the state to go after their internal political opponents in the mass. And we've seen, lawfare being used against Evo Morales, these sorts of politically motivated cases that have been taken against him. And you also mentioned, of course, that they tried to arrest him. So can you speak about this phenomenon of the use of lawfare? So using the courts, using the police to go after internal rivals in the mass.
Yeah, I think this really began because as the split began to become more evident, Evo Morales was still the president of the party. He wasn't president of the country, but he was president of the party, and he had the loyalty of most of the social movements that were affiliated to the party. In the same way, for example, that there's unions that are affiliated to the Labour Party. There's unions in Bolivia affiliated to most of them maintain their loyalty to Evo Morales entirely because of what I mentioned earlier, that there was a class split. This wasn't purely a personal split. This was actually a split along class lines. And the middle class faction around Luis Arce didn't have a majority for reasons of their social class, because the middle class are not the majority. So by not being able to control the party, they kind of had two options. One was to themselves split off and create their own new party, which was something that was very seriously discussed within their circles. For example, there used to be a party that kind of disappeared in the 20th century that was very important called the Socialist Party One. And actually, Luis Arce had been a member of this back in the 80s or something. And there were discussions about reviving this party, essentially leaving the mass. But others within his cabinet said, no, uh, the mass brand is so strong that we should take it for ourselves. The people will vote for us, whoever the candidate is, because of the brand. And the similar logic that you sometimes see in this country is the Labour Party with, whoever we put in this seat, they'll win, so it doesn't matter. So a judicial campaign begins to take legal control of the party. There's a ruling a couple of years ago that essentially transferred the legal status of the party to Luis Arce's faction.
And this is because there was a meeting, wasn't there, or there was a decision taken in which Evo Morales was involved to actually expel Luis Arce
There was a
from the
party congress. Yeah, there was a party congress that formalized, that expelled Luis Arce and a number of other people were around, sort of the principal people around him. So what they did was refuse to recognize that expulsion and take control of the party. And they did that. They took the legal status. It turned out to be somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory because just having the legal status and the brand and the colors wasn't enough to hold on to the electorate. As we've seen in this election, the Mass Party went from having 55% of the vote in 2020 to now having 3% of the vote. So their strategy of taking the party and believing that the base would blindly follow them turned out to be a losing strategy. It didn't work for them, but they were they felt that they were forced into that because there was no way for them to democratically take the party. So they had to use the lever of the state, the courts, the police. Really, what solidified for most ordinary people, I'm not talking about people in the upper echelons of politics, but for ordinary members of the party, what kind of solidified the split was when there were protests in favor of Evo Morales, the way that the police actually repressed those protests. You could have images of a marcher holding the indigenous Wipala flag with a bleeding head being led away by the police. And these photos were indistinguishable from the sort of photos you saw during the coup. And that's when most ordinary members realized that this is not our government. This is not our party. We no longer identify it. And that's why there was a decision by most of the base of the ordinary members of the party to not participate in these elections.
Can we just talk a bit about Evo Morales and some of the criticisms that have been leveled against him? Of course, he was banned from standing for re-election. And the pretext for the coup against him in 2019 was that people didn't accept that he had stood for a fourth term and had won that election. And they comically made the argument that he had rigged that election, which of course was completely untrue. But the 2009 constitution imposed a 2-term limit for presidents. So that meant that constitutionally he couldn't stand for re-election. And he obviously made the point that that breached his human rights, his right to stand for election. But there are those who say, well, Evo, you've had your time. Why not stand aside and just support somebody else to be the candidate? So could you address some of those criticisms?
Yeah, it's certainly true that in the Bolivian constitution, there's a limit to one re-election. And by that point, everyone had 3 terms, but one wasn't counted because that was under the previous constitution. He goes into for a 4th one, a 3rd under the new constitution. Essentially because in the same way Luis Arce has stacked the courts during his government, and the same way Janine Áñez stacked the courts to persecute Evo Morales and left under her government, Evo Morales also did it for his own government. And the courts ruled that he was allowed to stand for another term because limiting re-election was a violation of one's right to stand for election. Now, was this the right strategy? Was it the wrong strategy? I think people will have different opinions about that. On the one hand, you could say if you have a good president and the majority of people are happy with it and vote for it in a democratic election, then why not? Why limit that? Many countries don't have limits on re-elections. This country doesn't have a limit on re-election. There hasn't been much, anger about that. I think Harold Wilson or someone went numerous times. Thatcher was elected numerous times. If you've got something good, why rock the boat? But at the same time, it is a reality that Evo Morales himself and many of the people around him, many people who were his former ministers and who were the ones closest to him now, have essentially had the line that it can only be Evo. Evo's the only one. He's the chosen one. Essentially, they've taken something that was true, which is he was the best president the country has ever had in terms of poverty reduction and all the rest of it, and therefore he's the one that has to come back.
But there is truth in that, because obviously he does remain very popular, and clearly he continues to have a constituency of the country behind him. And of course, he was re-elected in
It
2019.
becomes a question of, you know, if someone in purely democratic terms has the majority support, should they be allowed to go numerous times, or should that be limited and there be a rotation of who's in power and and find someone who can implement the same policies? And I think there's strong arguments on both sides. It is a fact though that the majority of the membership of the mass wanted Evo to run for another term. So should that be respected, or should other concerns about term limits be respected? Personally, in my opinion, I think that there's many problems in Latin America. There's many giant social issues. Not having enough presidents hasn't been one of them, I would say. In fact, Bolivia is a country that's had too many presidents. Presidents that have been in power for 1 week, president and been couped, or presidents come to power through a coup, then couped themselves a few days later. Is actually political instability is a massive, massive obstacle to economic development, and that is true not just in Bolivia, across the whole of Latin America. And it's constant chaos, constant changing of governments, and all of this is actually something that does benefit those who seek to divide and rule. And that's why we've seen, for example, in China, we've seen term limits removed in China. Xi Jinping says, we have this plan, a long-term plan. We have to have the stability to see it through. And that was Evo Morales' argument. There was a lot of talk about there is a young union leader within Evo Morales' own union who emerged as a possible successor, and who was built up by Evo Morales himself as as the future of politics and of the movement. He ended up jumping the gun. He put himself forward for this elections. Andrónico Rodriguez, he's actually someone I worked on his Senate campaign in 2020. We went with him all around the country. With him, I saw a number of people that he began to bring around him. This kind of class of sort of progressive middle class advisors who emerge once you have a position of authority, sort of telling him, no, this is your time. You have to, it's your turn. You have to run. And his position was always, you can do this through primaries and through, a democratic, we'll see who the bases want. In the context of the past few years and assassination attempts against Evo and things, it became very clear that people didn't want to broach this topic, that people wanted Evo to come back. And it would be clear that any attempt to challenge him in a democratic manner wouldn't really be possible because of the mood within the party. And so he decides to go out himself.
And he's denounced as a traitor as well, of course.
Denounced as a traitor, but could Evo Morales have had a project in which he supported a possible candidacy of someone like that and accepted a lesser role, perhaps as vice president, perhaps as a minister or something? I don't know. These are all questions that were had internally, but it's not so black and white. It's not purely the case that just because he enjoys majority popularity means that no successor should ever be appointed and that he should run until he dies. But it's also not true that this, for reasons of pure personal ambition, that he wants to be president forever. That neither of these things are true, and it's actually a lot more complex than that. And I think we have to decide which things are more important, whether a continuity of a project and the desire of members has to take priority, or if the renovation and renewal of the project takes priority. I don't think those things have to be in conflict or in contradiction to each other. But if they're not to be, then how does that happen? It's a very difficult thing to navigate. They clearly have not navigated it in the right way, because we wouldn't have the result that we have today. But I think it's actually something that most parties face at one point or another.
I mean, personally, I would say that this whole notion of term limits is a foolish idea, really. I mean, in some cases, it might make sense. So, for example, judges on a Supreme Court, and those positions are actually unelected anyway. So that sort of thing makes sense in terms of age and, you know, mental sobriety and that sort of thing. But in terms of a democratically elected position, it's a bit silly to have a position where the majority of the country could support somebody, but because of the legal wording in a constitution, they can't then stand for re-election, which is actually quite anti-democratic.
I mean, they're arbitrary as well. Why two-term limits, not three? Why not four? Why not five? Like, these are arbitrary terms that were adopted from, especially from the United States, from other constitutions. I think there's particularly when you take into account the challenges of development, the massive challenges of poverty, for example, the issue of alternation of power becomes less important when you look at the enormity of the social challenges. You know, if I think if people could take 20 years of one president with greater solutions of these issues, I think most people will probably accept that. But in Bolivia, it became a massively contentious issue.
In this election, Evo Morales urged people to cast a null vote to spoil their ballot, because voting is compulsory in Bolivia. So either you vote or you spoil your ballot. Why not compromise, though, and support a different left candidate like Andrónico Rodriguez? What was the thinking in terms of not supporting someone else to get elected to combat the right, and instead pursue this strategy of trying to delegitimize the election itself?
Well, I think I've had a lot of people mention, for example, Lula da Silva in Brazil was banned from standing and then supported another candidate in his place. Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. All of these people had the same lawfare campaigns against them, couldn't stand, supported other candidates, successors, etc. I think that's not a fair comparison in this regard, because in all of these cases, candidates that were supported by Lula, by Kirchner, by Correa, were people that came from their parties, and these candidates were chosen in a democratic fashion within the party. Evo Morales doesn't have a party now. He doesn't have a party that is contesting the elections, and the candidates who position themselves as on the left don't come from his party. In the case of the MAS, of Luis Arce's MAS, is actively hostile to Evo Morales and are the ones responsible for the lawfare campaign against him. I don't think Evo Morales, I don't think anyone in his position would call for a tactical vote for the person who has kept you off the ballot and who has persecuted both you and the party's members. In the case of Andrónico Rodriguez, I think this is more interesting. Many people on the left, including people who identify with Evo Morales, decided to vote for Andrónico Rodriguez. However, he also has not come from Evo. He's not standing for Evo Morales' movement. He made created his own political party with people that didn't come from the original MAS, and he didn't seek out Evo Morales' support, and he didn't run a campaign aimed at Evo Morales' voters. He ran one aimed at the more middle class vote. So in the face of that, the original masses, party members, working class and indigenous supporters, didn't see themselves represented in that campaign either. So, then it becomes a question of, if we don't feel represented, should we participate? Should we vote for a lesser evil candidate? Now, that's a question of strategy, right? That's not. It was presented certainly in Bolivia as a moral question. There was a lot of moralizing and moral blackmail going into it on all sides. But I think questions like that are strategic questions for the left. In every country, there's always been a discussion. Should you vote for the Labour Party? Should you vote for the Democrats in the United States? And comrades, good comrades, can have always argued on both sides of these questions. But one thing I think is important to should be an important principle of electoral politics is that nobody owes you their vote, right? Nobody owes you their vote. Voters do not have a responsibility to political parties. It's the political parties that have a responsibility to earn the vote of the population. And when you have a situation in which voters have voted for your party, then abandoned it 5 years later, that is the fault of the party who has lost those votes because they're the ones who have been abandoned. They're the ones who have lost the trust of the people who elected them. So that's not the fault of voters for not having sufficient loyalty to a party. It's the fault of the party for losing the loyalty and trust of its basis.
I mean, another one of those examples you mentioned, of course, is the Workers' Party in Brazil. So at that time, Lula da Silva was incarcerated. His ally Dilma Rousseff had been impeached from the presidency. So they had to support an alternative candidate for election. And the person that they chose, Fernando Haddad, lost catastrophically against Jair Bolsonaro. So supporting an alternative candidate doesn't necessarily get you to where you want to be. I mean, Haddad had the full backing of the Workers' Party. He was endorsed by Lula da Silva, but that still wasn't enough to get him over the finishing line because he wasn't Lula da Silva, right? So sometimes you do need that popular unifying candidate who, as an individual, can unite those different constituencies to go into an election and win.
Yeah, and another thing that makes Bolivia's situation different to those other ones was that the Workers' Party in Brazil still were able to stand. It wasn't Lula, but the Workers' Party was still standing. Same in Argentina, same in Ecuador. It was the party wasn't banned; it was the leader who was banned. In the case of Evo Morales, it wasn't only Evo Morales was banned; any electoral vehicle that he was using was banned. So as he actually tried a number of different routes to get onto the ballot paper. There was a number of different, like very small parties that basically gave him their legal status as a vehicle for him to stand. One by one, all of them were banned. So in that situation in which your entire movement has been excluded, do you then cast a vote for someone else? Someone else who actually hasn't defended you in that situation, hasn't spoken out against the banning of your movement and of yourself. Do you lend your vote to them? Now, some people said yes. Some people said, many people who I know, good comrades said, despite all of this, it will be disastrous if the left is left with no representation in Congress, for example, which is now the case. Andrónico Rodriguez has about 3 diputados, or you call MPs, in the lower house. That's it. Nothing in the Senate. The Mass has nothing in either house. And it will be now a right-wing government that is, although fractured in terms of no one party has a majority, but almost entirely formed of right-wing parties. However, it was the decision of a majority of members of the original Mass Party and Evo Morales' movement to not participate because they felt that they had been excluded.
Well, very interestingly, looking at the results of the first round of the presidential election, you had Rodrigo Paz getting, I think, 32% of the vote. You then had Jorge Quiroga getting about 27% of the vote, and the null vote got 20%. So that's 1/5 of people who cast their votes in Bolivia just outright rejecting the whole election. Now, the way that it works is that the null vote doesn't materially affect the election in the sense that it doesn't stop the second round from going ahead. It doesn't mean that the vote has to be redone. But that's quite a damning indictment of the election process. I mean, it's pretty stunning, isn't it?
Yeah, and the government, the current Luis Arce's Mass Party, has essentially blamed Evo Morales, saying, you were reckless in promoting this null vote. You could have supported one of us, and we wouldn't have been railroaded in this way. But again, I think political parties who think the voters owe them something should remember that that's not necessarily how electoral politics works, and that's not how it works in the minds. And it's not Evo Morales who spoilt all those ballots. Elections are, in every country of the world, is something that you do individually. You are there. You're not at a rally. You're not at a union meeting where people can see whether you raise your hand or not. You're in the privacy of the voting booth, and 20% and 21% of the electorate decided to spoil their ballot deliberately without Evo Morales looking over their shoulder, without other people in their movement looking over their shoulder. They did it voluntarily. Are all of those people wrong, or are you wrong for not representing them any longer?
Just turning now to a more sort of international look at the fallout of this election. Obviously, it has lots of implications for Bolivians themselves. But a change of president in Bolivia doesn't just affect Bolivians, it has ripple effects across Latin America. So when Janine Áñez took over in 2019, Bolivia became much more pro US. It broke ties with ALBA, which is the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America. That currently has 10 member states in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 2 observer states, which actually includes the Islamic Republic of Iran. Under Áñez, Bolivia recognized the comical Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. For those of you who, I'm just speaking to our viewers who happily forgot the existence of this chance, I regret that I had to say his name again. But I mean, that happened, of course. So, what does this actually mean for these other countries in Latin America, these intergovernmental organizations, and also, anti-imperialist countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, who are or have been in alliance with a country like Bolivia?
Yeah, in terms of the region itself, if we go back a couple of years, you essentially have a situation in which a majority, well, a very large quantity of Latin America actually has governments of the left, very broadly speaking, of the left. Lula in Brazil, you had Fernandez in Argentina, Boric in Chile, Gustavo Petro in Colombia, um, AMLO in Mexico, numerous others, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. The reality though, and you can post these maps with, all of this red filled in covering this vast sort of stretch of land. The reality is that this wave of the left, of left wing governments, has lost its momentum, especially when you compare it to the first pink tide, when the days of Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales and Rafael Correa, there was so much revolutionary energy at that time, and that translated into structural integration as well. A number of different, organizations of regional integration were created by those governments, UNASUR, and which was strengthened during this time, and ALBA, etc. And there was numerous sort of cooperation projects, investments between these countries to integrate their economies. We haven't seen that in this current wave. What we've seen, particularly, Chile and Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia, is actually the presidents looking inwards. These governments looking inwards, firefighting domestic problems without having a wider international vision. And that has massively weakened the Latin American left. They no longer even really see each other. They no longer really even have summits where they meet each other. It's very rare. No cooperation projects, no cross-border investments that you saw in the first pink tide. And so I think this is a big reason for why these governments have been so weak, why these governments haven't been able to build the momentum behind themselves that their predecessors had. So I think we need to look at that. Just being very disappointing, either when you consider the fact that countries like Brazil, Colombia, these are massive economies in the region, massively important strategic countries for Latin America, having governments of the left, but which have made very little to no effort really to build a kind of international movement between themselves, and they've only been focused on sort of firefighting domestic problems. So I think that a lack of international vision has been a weakness of the Latin American left in this stage of things.
Well, you talk about this weakness of international vision. I mean, I also wonder how this could affect, Bolivia's position on Palestine, because even under Luis Arce, Bolivia cut diplomatic relations with the Zionist regime in October 2023, so that was quite early on. I think they were probably propelled by people like Gustavo Petro in Colombia, who took the sort of first steps really in early October to denounce the genocide. Bolivia also joined South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice. Presumably, that's all out the window now.
I would say yes. It would the degree to which it's out of the window depends on who wins the second round voting. Although both candidates who are entering the second round, Rodrigo Paz and Jorge Quiroga, both are neoliberals. Both are candidates who propose a program of austerity and privatization and of realignment to the United States. There is a difference between them. Jorge Quiroga has already been the president. He is an asset of the United States. He still live in the United States. He is working on behalf of the United States government and its embassy. If he is elected president, there will be a formal exit from BRICS. Bolivia is actually an associate, a partner country of BRICS. They will formally exit that. There will be a formal realignment to the United States away from China and Russia and others. A realignment towards Israel. That's something that will certainly happen, and that Jorge Quiroga has explicitly stated during his campaign will happen. In the case of Rodrigo Paz, is a bit of a more interesting figure. He's actually the son of another ex-president from the 80s who implemented neoliberalism. But during this campaign, he's attempted to portray himself as a more heterodox candidate, someone who was trying to reach out to working class voters. In fact, his vice presidential candidate is actually a TikToker, an anti-corruption TikToker, a guy who's actually used to be a police officer who was expelled from the police for exposing corruption. They've tried to position themselves as not being part of the traditional right. So I think what we'll see in that government is an attempt to balance realignment with the United States with trying to maintain relations or investments from China and Russia. And I don't think we'll see issues of Israel. I think will be of secondary importance to them, which won't be for example, for Jorge Quiroga, who make a big statement about realigning to Israel. I think that will be less of a priority for Rodrigo Paz. But we will see. We will see a realignment in that regard. It depends on the extent of it.
Well, you mentioned, of course, with Rodrigo Paz, that he's sort of, let's say, not from the traditional right, not maybe we wouldn't call him directly a asset of the United States of
Mm.
America. What sort of policy changes would we expect in Bolivia itself? I mean, this is also a very important consideration. I mean, would we see this sort of huge privatization that someone like Jorge Quiroga is already saying that he wants to do? Is that
Yeah.
likely?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And his own father used to be the president, and in fact, at one point, Quiroga was a minister under his father's government. So the differences between them are not great, but they are. I think there will be an attempt from Rodrigo Paz to be a slightly more unifying figure. I think the pace of change will be slightly different than if Quiroga is elected. Um, but I think one thing to note, sort of stepping back a bit from that, is yes, a new government is going to come in and is going to be a right wing government. That doesn't mean that government is going to govern 5 years, is going to govern its full term. Bolivia is a rebellious country, the most rebellious country in Latin America. Is a country that has constant insurrections, that makes itself ungovernable to presidents that are hostile to the country's national interests. And although the disillusionment in the mass has pushed many people to look for alternatives, when those alternatives become reality, when hospitals begin to be closed down, when the funding dries up for infrastructure projects, when fuel subsidies disappear and inflation goes up, when these things become a reality, you will see massive social conflict. You will see massive uprisings, mobilizations, and out of that will come. I think will come some sort of new left out of that, and one I think could take power before the term is up. I think it's unlikely that the new government that comes in will serve out its full term. I do think it will be a government that's overthrown if it does go down a path of rapid privatization and austerity. The Bolivian people have never accepted that peacefully. And the new government that comes in will not have a majority in Congress. They'll have to make corrupt deals with different parties, and just as corrupt coalition deals can come together, they can come apart just as easily, and they always have done in throughout Bolivia's history. So I think there's no final victory for them, and there's no final defeat for the social movements and Bolivia's workers' movements. We will see all of these questions being revisited again within a year or 2 years.
Well, that's certainly a more optimistic perspective that we probably won't be hearing from many people who are obviously quite distraught at the fact that the MAS has had this internal implosion, that Evo Morales has been excluded. Obviously, it's very depressing for a lot of people, but I mean, that sort of gives hope as well that it's not going to be plain sailing for this new regime. Just lastly, what do you think, given your experience on the ground? I mean, you've been very intimately involved in all of this. You've seen it going on. You've actually been in close contact with the people involved in the mass. What are the key lessons that people around the world, not just those in leftist movements, but those in progressive, revolutionary political movements, should take on board?
Some of the most important lessons are not purely to do with party unity. I think the Bolivian experience should be studied primarily for its successes in terms of how it managed to democratize the state, create a new constitution that made democracy more participatory. Those lessons should be taken on board. The less should stand for being the guiding force in the economy, as it was during Evo Morales' years, to bring development, to not only bring public services back into public ownership, because in many countries today, even public services now are privatized, but actually the state should go beyond that to play a participatory role in the economy and in the market. And there's a number of different things that very interesting about the Bolivian experience in that regard. Those are all things that people can take lessons from. But also, you know, people should be always be very aware, I think, of however successful a project can be, however high one can be riding, that things can always come crashing down, and it not necessarily always going to come from external forces or the media trying to bring you down. Cracks can begin to and contradictions can begin to emerge within your own movement. And those contradictions emerge from the fact that there's different forces within your own movement. There's different class forces, there's different, cultural forces. And you have to be able to think about how you're going to balance that and not pretend that they don't exist. I think people should be aware of the different constituencies that are within your different movements and different parties, and how that can be channeled in a constructive way rather than papered over in a way that can then explode a few years down the line. If those lessons can be learned, if people can see the dramatic consequences that you know petty fights over petty things can have on a macro scale, I think that's also a very important lesson that one can have, that one can take. The destruction of the project as a whole is never worth any short term gains for your side or oneself. So a cautionary tale, but also I think lessons are of inspiration of what is possible for our government and the left to achieve.
I think what you said there about being, hyper aware at all times that the enemy is always on the march. I mean, you said, and you sort of quoted a bit from actually Tony Benn, this old stalwart of the British left, saying that there's no final victory and there's no final defeat. Some people, when they achieve a victory, particularly one of epic proportions, I mean, these are the sort of victories that have been achieved in Bolivia, especially the overturning of the coup. I mean, that was an unbelievable victory for social movements in Bolivia. They seem to think that, okay, that's the end of the story now. We've achieved victory, and we've achieved victory for all time. But of course, the enemy is always on the march. And also, as well, you were saying something very important about internal divisions, splits. Uh, these things are, of course, very important to be wary of, to deal with well. And we've seen this not just happen in Bolivia, but in other countries where these internal divisions have sunk the movement. And on that note, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So thank you very much for joining me today, Ollie. And thank you very much to all of our viewers and listeners. See you next time.